Okay, as everyone gets settled in, we're going to start in a couple of minutes. Just to give everyone time to get settled and get in. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay and found the webinar okay. There is some information on the Facebook event. So if anyone that you know is having trouble getting in, you can let them know that they can register at the link on the Facebook event. And there's also a way to call in. So I'm not sure if the email that everyone received gave them information about how to call in, but that's also listed on the Facebook event. Essentially, you would call that normal Zoom number, and then you would enter the webinar ID. And then you'll be in as an attendee, as a call-in listener. So we're going to get started. Thank you so much for coming. So this webinar is about gender awareness when you're working with youth. To give a little bit of background as to why the Commission on Human Relations is doing this webinar, back in late May and early June, we had two related webinars that addressed gender awareness in the media and in Pittsburgh's larger community. And from that webinar, we received some feedback from parents and from educators that they would like something specific to what they do and to being able to support the trans and non-binary youth in their communities. So we wanted to get in contact with some of our community experts and give you this training. Just a little bit of background, the welcome of what we're doing today is happening right now. And I've given a little bit of the framing for today's webinar. In terms of troubleshooting in tech, the way that this webinar is set up, if you would like to ask us a question, please use the Q&A. The chat is disabled, but you can always ask a question in the Q&A, which should be on the bottom of your screen. The interpreter video is pinned, so what you'll see if you are using one screen, unless you choose otherwise, is the screen that I'm sharing and the interpreter, and you'll be able to hear my voice. If for whatever reason you would like to see my face and the interpreter, you can also choose to use side-by-side view. The reason that we're doing it this way with the interpreter's video pinned is so that people who need access to the interpreter will be able to see them more readily and more easily. So this is me. This is me as the training facilitator. My name is Jam Hammond. I work for the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. And what that office is an office that enforces the laws against discrimination in the city of Pittsburgh. We enforce laws against discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations, and sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, referred together as SOGI. These are protected classes in the city of Pittsburgh. And if you or your youth that you support experiences discrimination because of their gender identity or gender expression in Pittsburgh, in employment, in housing, and public accommodations, you can give us a call. My information will be at the end of the webinar. Also, if you experience discrimination or a youth that you support experiences discrimination in an educational setting, that is also protected, but it's protected under the PA Human Relations Law. And for that, you would contact the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. If you don't know how to get in contact with them, you can always give us a call. So to give some background about what we're going to discuss in this training, we're going to first talk a little bit about gender and gender development so that we are all starting from the same place of understanding the differences between sex, gender, and sexual orientation. We're then going to talk about some of the issues that youth experience, in particular trans and non-binary youth. And then we're going to talk about ways that we can protect trans and non-binary youth. So this section is going to talk about sex, gender, and sexual development. We're going to start off talking about sex. And sex is a term that refers to a person's biological traits as they relate to their reproductive system, as they relate to their genetic composition, their biochemistry. So sex is typically developed in utero, and it can be assigned or determined at birth. It's usually stable over a person's lifetime, and as we said, it's determined by chromosomes and biochemistry. There's also a second part of sexual development beyond what happens in utero. When somebody enters their adolescence, secondary sex characteristics begin to appear. So this is important to know because sex is part of what we use as a society to construct gender. As we'll talk about in the next slide, gender is a socially constructed idea, but we use sex to construct our idea of gender. And in our social construction, we imagine two sexes, male and female, and then we imagine two genders, male and female. In reality, that's not necessarily how things work out. And just a note on sex is that there are sexes beyond male and female. One of the things that we're not going to talk about in depth today are people who are intersex. And people who are intersex are a sex determined or assigned at birth that is beyond male or female. And the reason we're not discussing it today is because although people who are intersex may identify with the trans experience, they have unique and separate experiences from trans communities. So in order to learn more about people who are intersex, it's important to gauge that community separately and treat it as something unique and separate from the rest of the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. The next thing we're going to talk about is gender. In this slide, we have gender identity and gender expression. Gender identity is how a person identifies themselves in terms of gender, the gender spectrum or spectrums, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And expression is how they express that identity through behavior, mannerisms, dress, different things like that. Gender, we can often see develop in early childhood around ages 3 through 6, and gender is not necessarily stable throughout the lifetime. That refers to both gender identity and gender expression. So somebody who is male identified and likes to wear dresses at 3 could say at age 6, I don't really like to wear dresses anymore, or at age 16, or whatever age. So it's not necessarily stable over someone's lifetime. It can be, but not necessarily. And gender categories are socially prescribed, as we talked about before. Uh, in our Western society, typically we acknowledge male and female, but there are genders beyond what has been prescribed by our social consciousness. And so gender is socially prescribed and it's also socially informed, but gender identity can be intrinsic. Just as an example, someone will experience a lot of factors that will play into how they express and interpret their gender identity. Someone could be intrinsically male identified, but the way that they express it will depend on other things they gather from their environment, from their family and peers, from their religion, from their school, and then on the largest level, from cultural norms, from public policy, from where they've grown up. So a lot of factors go into how somebody expresses their gender. So there's both an intrinsic and a social component to what we as a society will see as gender identity and gender expression. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is the development of orientation. And this is also not the topic of this webinar, but it is important to discuss. Orientation would be a pattern of attraction or lack of attraction, sexual, physical, emotional, to a certain group of people. And we often see that it develops around the same time as secondary sexual characteristics develop in adolescence. And it can often be confused or conflated with gender identity. So people, youth who are trans and non-binary can find themselves in a strange position when they're trying to interpret their sexual orientation, because we often use terms for sexual orientation that are defined by gender. What I mean by that is, if we have a person who's male identified, who's attracted to people who are male identified, we use the word gay. But if that original person had been female identified, we use the word straight. So that's what I mean when I say that the terms can be confused and conflated because of the type of language that we use. These are a couple of terms that everybody should know, and they'll become a little bit clearer as we go through the next few slides. Cisgender refers to a person whose gender and sex are aligned. So this is their sex assigned at birth. Transgender refers to a person whose gender and sex assigned at birth are not aligned. And while transgender can refer to what we would possibly consider somebody whose gender and sex are what in a binary system you could consider opposite, it can also be an umbrella term that refers to any person who does not identify with a gender identity that is aligned with their sex assigned at birth. That kind of brings us to the term non-binary, which is another term that can be considered a non-binary term. And it is a person who has a sex assigned at birth that is not aligned with their gender identity, nor is that gender identity aligned specifically with our binary system that we've created in society. The last thing that's important to talk about is dysphoria. Dysphoria means a feeling of discomfort that's associated with an intrinsic truth, not associated or aligned with the actual perception. In the case of trans and non-binary people, we're talking about their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth not being aligned, and therefore experiencing dysphoria. It could be body dysphoria, it could be related to the gender roles that they're asked to play, it could be related to the dress that they're asked to have. So there could be dysphoria associated with several aspects of gender. So hopefully this slide will clarify a little bit what we're talking about when we say aligned and when we're talking about binary systems. So when we're looking at gender binaries or gender systems, this system over here on the right on the left is going to be what we typically see when we talk about a gender binary system. And in this system, we have things that are associated with femaleness on the left and associated with maleness on the right. So you can see each of the categories that we talked about earlier, sex, gender identity, and gender expression. And then you can see how they're interpreted in terms of a gender binary. So for sex as female, assigned female at birth, or AFAB, or male, assigned male at birth, AMAB, and then gender identity as woman or man, gender expression, feminine, masculine. In the middle of this in this binary system, we have what appears to be sort of a neutral sort of area. But the reason that this binary system doesn't always work is that these categories, intersex, non-binary, androgynous, are not always really what we would consider as neutral. They can be valid and positive identities on their own. So on the right-hand side, we have a non-binary system. I will say this system goes a little bit farther to attempt to express what could be the reality of our world, but in reality, we could have arrows in every direction. Being neutral is a valid expression. Femaleness, valid. Maleness, valid. Neitherness, valid. And there are multiple types of non-binary identities that identify as neither male nor female. So we could have many different arrows, but this is a tool to kind of aid you in understanding what we're talking about when we're saying a binary system or a non-binary system. Binary meaning made of two parts, like this one. Non-binary, not made of two parts. Okay, so this is a diagram that displays a person who identifies as cisgender. Cisgender, again, refers to somebody whose gender and sex assigned at birth are aligned. So in this diagram, you can see this person identifies as female, cisgender, and perhaps they have some version of gender expression that we as a society recognize as female. So they identify as a woman, they're AFAB, and perhaps they like to wear dresses or they use the pronoun she, her. And you can see there that all of these sex, gender, identity, gender expression are aligned in this binary system. You can see in the non-binary system that they're also aligned. This is a person that is transgender, and this diagram could also describe someone like myself. So you can see that sex, AFAB, assigned female at birth, is not aligned here with uh, gender identity as man or gender expression as masculine. And you can see that also in the non-binary system. Now we're going to talk a little bit about non-binary as an identity itself. It can be an umbrella term or it can be an identity on its own. And a lot of trans people will identify as male or female, but equally valid are people who identify as non-binary. When we talk about non-binary, we're saying basically that the person's identity does not really align very well with this non-binary system that we've kind of created as a society. And someone could identify as non-binary, or they could choose to use other things underneath the non-binary umbrella to talk about their identity. So we could use the word genderqueer, we could use the word agender. In the gender neutral area, we could use bigender, we could use the word gender fluid, somebody who changes from one gender to another. There are a lot of different types of terms. So it's important when you get to know somebody that you learn which term is right for them and you use it correctly. So this is a non-binary person, and in this area, they've been attempted to be mapped onto a binary system. This person identifies as a poor gender, which is a gender that is neither male nor female. So in this binary system, they're not particularly well represented. This person identifies as assigned male at birth, as non-binary, but as a poor gender, and this it kind of looks like a neutral gender, and as having a feminine gender expression. In this non-binary system, it gets a little bit closer to the idea, it's a person whose sex is assigned male at birth and who prefers a feminine gender expression. This neitherness arrow shows that their gender identity is not neutral in any way. It's something positive and completely understood by them, but it's not male nor female. A poor gender is one kind of identity like that. Maverick is another, and there can be others. Again, important to find out what somebody specifically identifies as. So takeaways from this section, gender, sex, sexual orientation, these three are related topics, particularly in the way that we discuss them in society, but they are separate. So it's important to give people space to have separate identities for each of them. When we're thinking about youth, we can expect that they start to identify their gender identities and expressions starting around age 3, but gender identity, gender expression can fluctuate and change over somebody's lifetime. And while we tend to categorize gender and sex along binaries, we have created this concept as a society, and gender can take many different forms, not just male, female, or anything in a binary system. The next thing we're going to talk about are issues that affect youth, particularly in our case, non-binary and trans youth. So people who are trans and non-binary experience bullying at a much higher rate than people who identify as cis. In a combination of statistics from the National Bullying Prevention Center and a GLSEN School Climate Survey, we can see that about 20% of students report being bullied, whereas 65% of trans and non-binary youth report being bullied, specifically because of their gender identity or expression. And this is from the US Trans Survey by the National Center for Transgender Equality. And this is specifically numbers from Pennsylvania. So 77% of K through 12 students who are perceived as transgender experience mistreatment in school. In this case, mistreatment can include bullying, but also mistreatment by teachers or school administrators. And of this 77%, 55% experienced verbal harassment, 26% experienced physical assault, 11% experienced sexual assault, and 12% were forced to leave school because their mistreatment was so severe. This is a slide talking about mental and behavioral health. Trans and non-binary youth are more likely to experience problems and issues with mental and behavioral health. This is not necessarily surprising given what we've just discussed about bullying. When it comes to anxiety and depression, trans and non-binary youth are overrepresented. When we're looking at the population, we have a chart here. We can see of the general population, cis youth experience suicidal ideation at a rate of about 16%, whereas trans and non-binary youth are about 44%. We also see overrepresentation in persistent homelessness and feeling unsafe at school. Along with mental health and behavioral health, it's not uncommon for us to see substance use. And to that end, trans and non-binary youth report 2.5 to 4 times the rate of substance use. A note on physical health and sex ed, trans and non-binary youth within the umbrella of LGBTQ youth are not receiving the sex ed that they need. When they see sex ed, they're often seeing it presented as a cisgender representation of a heterosexual experience. And that's not the way that trans and non-binary youth experience, have sexual experiences. So when trans and non-binary youth go to have sexual experiences, they are not prepared in the same way that cis youth are. In the same vein, in the doctor's office, trans and non-binary people report that the doctors and providers, the people that they rely on for important information, often have no experience or don't know anything about the best practices. Finally, a note on homelessness. Trans and non-binary people are overrepresented in terms of homelessness, more likely to experience homelessness, particularly as a child, and more likely to experience homelessness, or less likely to ever own a home. In the graph here, we can see that in 2015, there was a US average of ever having experienced homelessness in a lifetime of 6%. For trans and non-binary people, it was about 30%. And then I also have a breakout here for Black trans women, which was 51%. It's important to note that when we have identities, minority identities that are intersectional, in all of these statistics, we'll often see overrepresentation. In this example, it's Black trans women, but we will see it in terms of disability, in terms of immigration status. Anytime that you have two intersecting minority identities, you're likely to see an overrepresentation. So some of the takeaways from this section, trans and non-binary youth are at risk for depression, anxiety, risky sexual behavior, and homelessness because of harmful social norms and lack of resources. So this is not something that is intrinsic to trans and non-binary youth. This has to do with the resources that they have and the way that society treats them. We also talked about gender identity expression. It should be supported and protected against bullying. Trans and non-binary youth are overrepresented there. And youth who are gender expansive need role models, both of positive behaviors, gender accepting behaviors, and of people who they can see their own gender identity in. Finally, this section is going to talk about protecting trans and non-binary youth. So what are the reasons that we want to protect and support trans and non-binary youth? We want to prevent homelessness, improve mental health, increase life satisfaction, and dissuade risk-seeking behaviors. So the first point of importance is to include gender identity and gender expression in anti-bullying conversations. And this is on two sides. First, it's important that adults actually address bullying that happens on gender identity and gender expression. If it's not addressed, it will continue. So adults need to step up and address these behaviors. The other thing to note is that gender identity and gender expression bullying affects more than trans and non-binary youth. Any youth who has a gender expansive expression, like for example, a masculine identified child who likes to wear dresses, or a female identified child who is cis but likes to play sports and gets bullied because of those reasons. Those are other examples of gender identity or gender expression bullying. And it affects more than trans and non-binary youth. Cis youth are at risk for this too. It's important that we gonna switch interpreters. So it's important that we support and normalize gender social transition. And while medical transition is something that youth and their parents and guardians can discuss, social transition is something that we can all support. This means supporting somebody's change in social factors from one gender expression to another, such as supporting a chosen name and using it in as many contexts as possible, supporting and using correct pronouns, never assuming someone's pronouns, always asking for the right one, making sure that you try to get it right, and acknowledging to everyone that it's your responsibility to get everyone's pronouns correct. And then supporting appropriate attire for all genders, for all people. Any attire that's appropriate for what you perceive as one gender should be appropriate for all the youth that you support. When you write your policies, your classroom rules, your house rules, make sure that you use gender neutral language as opposed to trying to guess all of the genders and saying fathers and mothers, or saying or excluding one, saying mothers, and then not saying fathers. Use a gender neutral term such as parent. I think providers have become very good at accepting multiple family constructions and saying parents and guardians. So taking it one step further and acknowledging that there are parents of multiple genders. These are just a couple of other examples of ways that you can use gender neutral language. The last thing that it is important to note is that it's important to engage trans and non-binary youth on their own. It's important to ask them their own opinions about their gender, how they see gender roles, how they see themselves fitting in. Having that conversation is going to normalize trans and non-binary youth, and it's also going to give them the idea that it's okay to talk about gender because it is. And the last thing that I can recommend is to take a comprehensive SOGI training, to take a safer spaces training. And once you take that training, make it known that your workspace or your home is a safe space for trans and non-binary youth. So with that said, we're going to start with the panel discussion. I'm going to add in the panelists as they come. So the first person that I'm going to introduce is Lyndsey Sickler. Lyndsey Sickler, they, them, there, is a non-binary femme queer advocate and educator who has worked with TLGBTQIA+ youth and young adults for over 20 years. They're a co-founder of TransPride PGH, a grassroots community group focused on networking, support, and advocacy for the trans and non-binary people in Pittsburgh in southwestern PA. Okay, the next person that I'm going to introduce is Darren Lucza. Darren is a youth support partner at the Allegheny County's Department of Human Services, and Darren has lived experience as a trans or non-binary youth in the system. The next person that I'm going to introduce is also part of our Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations team as a commissioner. Tracy Baton, LSW, is a licensed social worker, a historian, anthropologist, and community organizer who practices with youth and has experience navigating SOGI topics. The next person that I want to introduce is Sarah Rosso, they, them. Sarah is the executive director of the Hugh Wellness Foundation and has more than 15 years of experience working with LGBTQIA+ youth and supporting their welfare. The last person that I'm going to introduce is Rashod Brown. Rashod Xavier Brown, he, him, it was a program manager at Garden of Peace Project and is currently working with Project Silk. Rashod has a lot of experience with the trans and non-binary community. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to welcome our panel. Thank you guys so much for coming and being with us. There's a lot of experience here, so I want to get right into our Q&A. And I'll also be keeping an eye on the Q&A from the attendees. The first question that I'm going to ask everybody, but I'm going to start with Lyndsey. The way this is going to work, I'll pick out a particular panelist. I'll start with them, and then if other panelists have something to add, please do. I'm starting this question with Lyndsey Sickler. Oh, that's not true. I'm starting with Tracy. And sorry, Tracy. So the first question is about the way that we conceptualize the difference between sex and gender. My question to you as a professional is, how do you communicate that to other professionals, to youth, to parents, caretakers?
There. Now I'm unmuted. I
Yes.
think that it's a really important question because the key for me to working with youth, and I work with a broad range of people in a small practice that's largely poor African American people in the Mon Valley. So that means I work with children. Right now, my work is with children, youth, and their families. And the key to working with youth is the foundation that the children and their families have before their youth. Like their youth in about 2 seconds after their children. And if we can create foundations of learning that they move into youth in a safe space, then queer kids, Black kids, even in places like the Mon Valley, can feel safe to express who they are. One of the tools I've used with children is the genderbread person. And the panelists may know the genderbread person as a tool. And it's a really excellent tool as a way to talk about the differences between gender identity, gender expression, and anatomical sex to people who are very small or distracted or impatient. Um, and I have been really successful in facilitating conversations with children with this model. There are some updated models that include some more really important things about desire and partnering that I think are also important conversations to have with youth. So you can start with this model and move into some even more equally important conversations to have. But I think that it's a beginning of a powerful contribution that it should start earlier than most people are excited about. I mean, in my home, those conversations started from the time my children were small. They always knew. But in other homes and in schools and situations, that the children are never too young to start teaching them and modeling for them inclusive language and behavior. And then youth isn't shocky and difficult. In places like the Mon Valley, moving into youth as a queer child in any way is so incredibly difficult that the challenge is not working with that, only working with that child, but working with the whole community around bullying and tolerance and those kind of issues as well.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah. Is any other panelists want to take a swing at that question? Okay. Cool.
The
Well,
only thing that I would add, since no one said it for me, is that when we work with, I'm a licensed therapist and I do work with children and youth, but one of the important things is to destigmatize their struggles. So that when I work with children and youth who are suffering, it is important to decenter and say, this, you didn't do anything. You live in a difficult world for true. I can at least, and that is life-saving. And I think it's easy for queer adults to forget how much that casual participation in young lives is absolutely life-saving. Anyway, that's...
yeah. We have another question. We have a question from the attendees. It seems related. They asked, how can we help people better understand that a fluctuation in gender identity does not constitute a choice, a phase, or a misunderstanding? Does anyone want to add any insight to that? Lyndsey?
Yeah, actually, I have that in one of my responses. It really is integral, really, really important that we remove that whole ideology out. It's not a phase. And when a young person is dealing with discovering themselves, one of the worst things adults can do in their life is to dismiss their exploration, and it is something that negatively impacts them for the rest of their life. Believe your young people when they talk to you, even if you don't understand. Take a beat, listen, step back, and ask another adult. Reach out to organizations, get some information, and come back. That kind of dismissal is really, really detrimental to development.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly chime in and say, you know, sometimes our dismissal misses the bigger picture. So we have to remember that we need to allow space for youth to be and explore themselves, because the world is unkind and unfriendly to queer and trans folks. And so part of that discovery process, part of that fluidity could also be tied to expectations of other people, of safety considerations. And so not only could it be a fluid experience for that young person as they're navigating and questioning and figuring out who they are, which is really the whole point of being a young person, right? We're trying to figure out who we are, and we need to allow space for that. And we also need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to assure that their fluidity isn't related to safety or our own expectations or our own judgment about who they should be and how they should show up in the world.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. So I have another question I'm gonna ask to both Darren and to Rashod. The question is, from your own experience working with youth or being a youth, what are some barriers to success that you see trans and non-binary youth face? And do you think any of them are unique to the place that we live, Allegheny County or Pittsburgh? I'll go to Darren first, then to Rashod.
Yeah, so some of the barriers that that I've noticed is enrichment activities, like not knowing if you want to go and sign up for like a sports team or a club, and they're just like male and female, and they're not co-ed. For a lot of youth, that's like, well, what do we do? Especially for when they're coming out and stuff, and they just want to feel comfortable. And a lot for youth in their like early years is engagement with other kids. Now they can't engage the correct way if they're being left out of those clubs and sports at school. Because I know, like, from personal experience, I've attended CCAC in the past, and I've played basketball for the Allegheny campus. When I came out as transgender, my coach says, I don't know what team I'm supposed to put you on, the male or the female. I mean, now I did prefer female because their workouts were a little lighter, but it's just that stuff that you face every day. The other barrier being is access to transportation. So there are a lot of resources, in Allegheny County. You got Central Outreach, Rashod, the GLCC, Hugh Lane. You have all that stuff. But it comes down to whether youth can even get down to those places. And that's where the transportation barrier is. Yep. When we have, like, for me as a youth support partner, I can put a request in for bus tickets for kids. But if kids don't have that resource and don't have those type of workers, then they're left out. So I guess that's like two of the biggest barriers that I've seen.
Yeah, thank you. Rashod, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so the biggest one is that I'm noticing is with bathrooms, and the other one is actually having somebody there with you because for all your healthcare appointments, right? Mm-hmm. So you might have have somebody to go to get started on T or even your mental health, but going somewhere for the first time is a scary thing for somebody that's never been through it or never went through it. So having somebody who is also trans is a big plus, to be there and go with you, just to fill you in on what's happening, because a lot of the times certain languages that they use, and I'm just like, you can put it a certain way, a different way. And with the buddy one and the bathroom. With the bathroom situation, you wouldn't think that it would just be a big deal because it's the bathroom. Like, you're just going to the bathroom and then leaving. But the bathroom situation is so huge, like especially for trans women. It is so huge. Like I do not understand why we have so much, like people are so focused on trans people using the bathroom. That's another huge one. I just don't understand it. So those are like the two most problems that I hear about are the bathroom, and then having somebody to take you or go with you to your appointments, or even the resources to like for surgeons, for your testosterone or estrogen. I have a lot of people also come to me and ask me about like, where do they go? What surgeons are, because, you know, as a trans community, we always, hey, where's a good place to go? Like we want to know, like, your chest looks good. Where'd you go? Like, we always stay within each other.
Yeah. And at the end of this, I will have some resources. One of them is TransPride, and they are a resource that provides people to accompany trans people to doctor's appointments and to be sort of a healthcare advocate. But I will say, and they would say too, that not all of the people accompanying are trans identified. It can make some difference if the person is another trans identified person. We are looking to each other for advice and support. I don't know if anyone else wants to add on to that question before we move on. Okay. I might jump ahead in questions because we have a related question from the audience. And one of the questions that I was going to ask was to talk a little bit about intersectionality, areas that we see intersectionality. Another person from the audience asked, how are you combating the racism that Black trans youth are facing? As Black trans youth, we are fighting 2 wars every day because we're Black and trans. So this question about intersectionality, I'm going to ask first to Tracy, but then anyone else can chime in. Tracy, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have to unmute. Understanding oppression as multiplicative is critical, and it's not just to this work. It's critical to all of the work we do around oppression. There are lots of places to teach that. It might not just be right here, and that's really, really important. So we're talking about working with children, youth, and their communities and families, because children live in school, communities, family, all of those things are. Then we teach by teaching all the things in an intersectional way, in a way that understands the multiplicative nature of discrimination and personal transformation. Then all of them can benefit together, all boats rise. And so that means for trans and queer youth, maybe can understand a broader space, but creating that space where all boats rise is critical for everyone in the room, because homophobia isn't just fear, it's straitjacket for every child. And so when we bring something better, an understanding that is about the complex natures, the ways in which we oppress each other, to how we then everyone in that community can benefit. And the reason I think that that's important is because I, as a Black queer woman, have so often had to go to systems that are full of white men and sell them on the notion that paying for transformation is important to all of us, but I still firmly believe it. That even children who are not overtly discriminated against in that moment can benefit. And you can identify in queer youth, in Black, who is going to struggle with this throughout their life, and how. When we open that space, all boats rise. And I just think that doing work intersectionally with children and youth is critical for that reason. So anyway, though, was that really the question? Because what I was thinking.
I think so.
Sometimes I don't answer. Sometimes I just get excited. Thank you.
Yeah, anyone else wants to tag on to that topic?
Yeah, I think it's really critical that we understand an intersectional approach and embed intersectional and anti-racist approaches and frameworks to everything that we're doing. And so when we think about the experiences of Black trans youth in particular, we need to make sure that the white folks in the room are leaving space, that they're providing access, that they're providing resources, but they're not taking up the space. And so we need to be able to embed programs that are by and for Black and BIPOC trans youth and non-binary youth and queer youth, right? And we need to allow that to happen organically and make sure that we're providing that space. And we need to understand as a system, right? The adults and the teachers and the providers and everybody else needs to understand that not every organization has competency in this area. Not every organization is able to serve LGBTQ folks across the intersections of their race and ethnicity. And so it's really important to have a nuanced approach and make sure that we're doing everything we can. And our programs really should center those experiences, because if we look at the disparities that exist, they're most impactful and most harmful to queer and trans youth of color, right? And so we need to do better as a system, as providers, as white folks, as allies, as aspiring accomplices, as all of those things. We have to leave that space there to make sure that our programs are serving all of the communities and prioritizing those young people's experiences.
And I want to add on to that too, that, you know, you have a lot of like you said, you have a lot of organizations that, you know, can't do it or shouldn't do it. But you have all these people out here that has been doing the work. So paying the people that has been doing the work to come in and do the work is, you know, beneficial too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also in Pittsburgh, a real challenge in this space, and I think that, you know, being honest about these things, this is how I get in trouble, I'm about to say something else, but is that a lot of the people who are doing the work with Black kids and youth are church-based, and it's really hard to build, I'm sorry about the bridge metaphor, I always do it, build a bridge between those church-based organizations and LGBTQ organizations. I don't have solutions, but that is a real and substantive problem every day when you work with Black youth, is building bridges between, because nobody but churches are doing, well, a few, but a lot of that work with Black children and youth is done in ways that is not as inclusive of the LGBTQ community as it needs to be.
Sure. Okay, let's see. We have a couple other questions. I have a question about terms, but first I'll go to this question from the attendees. And it looks like maybe Darren wants to speak to this question of how you can illustrate the importance of using pronouns, the correct pronouns, to individuals who work in human services who haven't yet been exposed to queer culture.
Yeah, so that's something actually I've had experience with personally. Is I did come out as transgender while working as a youth support partner. And, you know, sometimes you just have to keep reminding people, like, hey, these are my pronouns. Because, you know, prior to me coming out, I was working at the office for, I'd say, 6-7 months. And then when I did come out, you know, it took a lot of adjustment on everyone in the office. I know Sarah Rosso actually came into our office and sat down, and we went over how to present myself, just even to the youth that I was going to be working with. So it just takes time. So, you know, just don't expect it to be rushed, because I thought everyone would get it in a day, and it really took time. It took a few months for people to actually catch on to, oh, Darren's not going by she anymore. Darren's going by he, and he's not going by his dead name. He's going by Darren. So it's just really a process. And, you know, there's people in the office that understand, you know, and have been exposed. And there's always going to be people around that's been exposed. So if you go to them and you ask them for support, they're willing to support you.
Yeah. And I'm just going to call out a term that Darren just used, which is dead name. It can be a noun or a verb. Dead name would be the name that somebody no longer uses to refer themselves, and to dead name somebody would be to call somebody by that name, which is something we want to avoid. what Darren said kind of speaks to the idea that, you know, everyone's trying to get it right and we are giving people space. If you are that person who makes a mistake, just make sure that you own that it's your mistake and that it's your job to, in the future, get it right. But everyone can take space and can work on improving themselves and their vocabulary. I don't know if anyone else wanted to hop on that question. Lyndsey, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's important that when you make a mistake to not make a big holy deal out of it, because then what you're doing is centering yourself and causing more harm. So it's absolutely okay to make mistakes. We all do it. We're human. But when you make the mistake, adjust and move on. It is not something that they need, you know, that the person that you misgendered needs to make you feel better about. You need to just move forward and try better the next time.
Yeah.
And I also want to add, don't be, because I've been around a lot of people who have been misgendering the person I'm with, and they'll be like, oh no, it's okay. No, it's not. Don't be afraid to keep correcting people. Because if you have to do it like just once and you'll be like, oh no, it's okay, but this is what I go by. And then they're like, oh, they just hear that, oh, it's okay part. No, you need to keep correcting people every single time that they get it wrong. They'll get tired of you correcting them, but they'll change if they're not being a butthole.
I had to speak to someone who wouldn't change about someone else, and I thought I was helpful because I told her when I lived in Florida, this woman persistently called me a negress. She thought it was polite. She said she didn't mean anything to it, but she called me and referred to me as a negress. I mean, she thought that was polite for nigger. Like, it's not. And I told the person what you were doing is exactly the same as her. You think you're polite, but you're not polite. Somebody told you it wasn't polite. So sometimes it takes a metaphor to get the person to like move forward. So I've used that when there are other choices. The other one that will sometimes work is you wouldn't use a name someone changed. Like you can figure out when people get married. I mean, people are changing their names all the time. I didn't, but people do that. You can figure that out. You have before. So, I mean, I totally agree with Rashod that sometimes it's important to just like stop the conversation and say, stop the nonsense.
Yeah. And I'll just call it a term that Rashod used, which is misgendering. This is when you refer to somebody with a gendered term that doesn't fit their gender, like using the wrong pronouns or using the wrong term, like calling somebody who is masculine identified an actress. This would be misgendering. It's another thing that we want to avoid. And I will say Rashod's point is very important. It's something I definitely struggle with. You know, I have a little bit of a higher voice. And so when people call me on the phone, they refer to me as ma'am, and I usually say nothing. And two things to say about that is first, you know, when somebody corrects you that you've misgendered them, it takes a lot of time and effort for a person who's trans and non-binary to say, that's not the right way to refer to me, because they're doing it all day. So the reason that I don't say anything is because it would take my time and effort, and I just kind of give up. When somebody takes all of that time and effort to tell you, you misgendered me, they're telling you a compliment. They're saying, I respect you, I know that I'm gonna work with you in the future, and I'd like us to have a normal working relationship. So this is the way that you're going to refer to me to be respectful. And I'll also say that as a trans person, I should do better about it. I know it takes a lot of time and effort, but yeah.
Oh no, like you, when somebody calls me like a telemarketer or a bill collector, they'll be like, yeah, ma'am. And I would like sometimes I just get to that point where I'm just like, I'm a he. He, him, his.
Yeah, yeah.
I tell them I'm a she, and you know, hey, they always get it wrong. I definitely have the deepest, most masculine voice in this conversation, and at night it's deeper. Believe me, you call me at night, hello, but I still correct people because I don't have to correct people all day, and that's my suggestion for people who don't have to do the work all the time. That's why I always put she, her. I make people go do the work. I was at the DNC and people were like, when I have conversations about that, and it opens up space for me to have conversations with people who wouldn't otherwise. So I put she, her after my name, and people, consistently have questions, even though I'm cis female.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another important tool for allies of trans and non-binary youth. We talked about a few terms. I'm going first to Sarah with this question, but of course to everybody. Is there a term that we should all know, or is there something that parents and providers need to know that maybe is less known when working with trans and non-binary youth?
Yeah, so I'm going to focus in on what parents and providers should know when they're working with trans and non-binary youth. And I want to encourage parents especially to remember to lead with love, right? So if you think about leading and use that as an acronym and think about like letting your affection show, express your pain away from your child, you know, avoid rejecting behaviors and do good before you feel good. This is not my words. This is not my information. This is literally a researched video program. But if you think about leading, that's what your role is as a caregiver, right? You're supposed to be leading and supporting young people. And it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to entirely compute for you to be able to show up and still avoid those rejecting behaviors and find a path forward and do things to be affectionate, to still be a parent, to still care and love for your child. So on the parent side, that's important. As a provider, we need to understand how we can support and move caregivers and others who are struggling with this information to a place where they can be supported, because we understand that family rejection is one of the single greatest contributors to health disparities that trans youth especially are experiencing, right? That contribute to all of those statistics that Jam shared earlier. So that's our role. We need to bridge the gap, and we need to pull folks together and help them get the information and support that they need. And there are services out there, there are supports out there that are meant to lift up folks. And so, you know, that's what we should be doing, is helping point folks in that direction.
Thank you. Any other panelists have, Lyndsey, were you gonna add something? We're just reaching towards your computer, okay. Any other panelists have a piece of advice or a term that they know that they haven't, they don't think that parents or providers know and they should know? Here, I'll think of one. Does anyone want to explain?
I think it's important to have conversations. I'm sorry. I think it's really important to have conversations with parents about microaggression and what that really is, what it looks like, what it feels like, because that is the key thing that my youth experience. And as a parent, particularly a parent who's never been discriminated against in any other way, you may think that oppression is that like harsh name we can all come up with a short list of, when that's not the experience my youth have. It's the, I don't really like that, or it's microaggression that does them the most harm. And yet we have so many stories, particularly around toxic masculinity, about how if you hurts your feelings, then you're supposed to put up with it. I mean, the things that I hear from told to my youth, like if that hurts your feelings, then that means they're right. I have had so many children whose parents told them, if someone makes you cry, that probably means it's true. So microaggression is a term I would want to have talk to them and talk to them about the consequences of it as far as a traumatized community. But I always come back to trauma anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. That's really important. I muted myself. We kind of touched on this a little bit with what Sarah had mentioned, but I'm going to ask a question to Lyndsey first and to the rest of the panel. How do you see issues of trans and non-binary representation in healthcare, homelessness, and education play out in your work?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff we've talked about, it's dealing with a lot of barriers. The lack of acceptance from educators, from healthcare workers, from providers can be a huge detriment. Dealing with guilt and shame around, you know, trying to be who they are authentically. Having to deal with dead naming, people purposely using wrong pronouns and not making an effort. And this is especially harmful when it's your friend circle and people in your family. Proselytizing religious beliefs as a way to make trans and non-binary youth feel like displaced. Bullying not only by youth but also by adults, and the bullying by adults happens a lot more than people recognize. And as we've already talked about, but really needs to not ever be lost focus on, is all of these issues are completely amplified for Black, trans, and non-binary youth across the board.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about shame. I had a conversation the other day, or rather, I had a conversation growing up where I had asked like a Yahoo Answers or something, like, how should I, change bathrooms? Is it going to offend somebody if I turn up in a different bathroom? Someone answered, well, obviously by you asking the question, you know that it's wrong to go into another bathroom. And it's interesting, it's not the reason I asked the question. I think sometimes people underestimate how much trans and non-binary people think about whether their very identity is going to offend somebody or whether they're imposing on someone else's space. And it's a lot of shame and guilt for just to be yourself. So that's a really important point that you brought up.
Yeah, that's actually something that's really integral to everything I do and try to inject into my work every day. There should be no shame in your game, ever. You need to be proud and stand in who you are, however that is, whenever that is, and you should be surrounding yourself with people that support you in that.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to hop on that question at all? Darren?
Yeah, so I think like another hard aspect, and this has to deal with like the educational piece, is there's two parts. When a transgender youth comes out and they're just only comfortable coming out with to like the guidance counselor or their teachers, that results into, okay, does the teacher need to be calling the youth by what they prefer to be called? But what if they're not out to their peers yet? That it's kind of like, are they going to be the ones out in the youth when and that's not okay. The other problem is like that I've noticed is a lot of transgender youth, they can't go to the bathroom at school. And if they do, it has to be the nurse office, which could be at the other end of the building. And it's like, at that point, a lot of the youth, they just hold it in all day, and that could cause a medical problem on its own. So, I feel like a lot of schools need to get on board and try to start a discussion on getting a gender neutral bathrooms into the schooling.
Yeah, those are such two good points. And that actually, the first one kind of hits on a question from the attendees about teachers accidentally outing their students trying to be supportive. One of the attendees asked, are there any common mistakes that potential allies make when trying to support youth? I don't know if anyone wants to hop on that question.
I think to sort of lean into what you were just saying there, Jam, about like being cautious. If you are an ally and a young person has trust in you and they come out to you, that doesn't mean that that's your information to share. Mm-hmm. Because young people are sometimes in vulnerable positions, and sharing that information or documenting that information can put them at risk. And so it's really important to check in with youth and make sure we know who they're out to, who it's safe for them to be out to, that we're asking how we can show up for them, as Shauna would say all the time. And so like, those are the things that we sometimes get tripped up in, is that we get excited and we want to support young queer and trans youth. And sometimes we have to be a little cautious and be thoughtful about how we're safety planning and assessing the situation for them, because it can be a vulnerable time depending on who their caregivers are or what their living situation is, or a whole variety of other factors.
I wanted to bring up. Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Ben.
No, you go ahead.
Sir. What were you saying, sir?
I was saying, I was on Facebook and I saw this. There was a link. I was trying to find it, but there's this link of this mother. She got on. I don't know if y'all seen her or not, but there was this link of this mother who got on Facebook on her child's on her child's profile and made a video basically saying that her child, she kept naming her the child's dead name that she gave her, and saying that the child was not a he, and that everybody needs to stop with this nonsense, and whoever calls him a he, then they will be blocked, and all this other stuff. And that right there is, first of all, it's coming from your own mother. So you have to go home to that. And then second of all, that's live. That's on your profile. That's going to be on there for years to come. That right there is one of the reasons why trans men have a higher rate of suicides from your own family too. I just had to bring that up.
Yeah.
For young, how do I put this? For Black youth that I have worked with who come out as queer, the incidence of physical abuse is really, really astronomical. Just, and that might not be necessarily because that's the youth who come out to me. Like that's what I know. I'm not saying comparatively. I'm just saying that I know from what people have told, from that, yeah, the incidence of physical abuse is terrifying. More than anybody would think, and pretty violent. Pretty explosively, terrifyingly violent. And I mean, I've had to get kids out of houses and stuff in ways that you would just never think you would have to. Those kids you need to know it's not their fault, and need to know that they're, I think that the It Gets Better project, and I'm sure a bunch of people here know about that. It's not everything, but it really can be helpful, particularly if you're working with youth who are in rural places that are very disconnected and you can't offer them urban face-to-face resources. I've connected youth to that It Gets Better project. And that's just like testimonies. And we can be that in part. I mean, by being willing to, if you aren't visually queer, speak about it, that's supportive and helpful as well, just by being a body who's there.
Yeah.
And we don't have to out youth to themselves. I have twice in my working life had a adult thought it was their job to tell somebody what they were. And that's never your job. It's just never. You do so much harm, and do not think in your kindly, and that's frustrating when that happens. I can see Sarah has had that experience as well. And you can't put the genie back in the bottle, and it's a really, really, really bad place to be.
Yeah. So I'll have 2 more questions. They're both questions that I'll ask. I'll go around the panel, and you can decide to answer or not. The first one has to do with policies or behaviors. So what policy or behavior do you think we should see from parents, from educators, from providers that would drastically change the outcomes for trans and non-binary youth? And I'll go first to Rashod.
The bathroom. bathroom policy. And it's just something so simple as gender neutral, or because we actually had, me and some other people, we had a panel and a discussion on this of, should we put a gender neutral restroom, or should we implement something, all the bathrooms are gender neutral? And it got iffy, because if some said if you created a gender neutral restroom outside of the other 2 that already exist, then that's targeting trans youth. It leaves people to target trans youth. And then some said that if you made all of the bathrooms gender neutral, then you would have people just abusing that and going into whatever bathroom they felt like it. So I don't know which one, but I feel like there has to be a policy on the bathrooms because that's such a huge deal. And I think that a lot of, because I noticed that has happened to me where I went to UPMC, the women's hospital, and like because they have, this is what they told me, they have certain records that I got before I started transitioning, and so I have to go do all this whole charades of changing just a gender marker on it. I could change my name, it was easy, but I couldn't change my gender marker. So to this day, I still have F on it. So there has to be something in there that just like your name, you can change your gender marker as easily. And I feel like everybody in that building should get a training on how to treat a basic human being.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Any other panelists? Lyndsey?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a couple things that I have suggestions about as far as policies and things. And some of them seem simple, but it's stuff that people don't generally think about. You know, really, if you really are wanting to be an advocate for trans and non-binary youth, you have to work on trust building. Like, you can't just assume because you're in a position of authority or you're a teacher, an educator, an advocate, that a youth is just going to trust you. You have to, you know, and from little to large ways, when you're speaking to a youth, you need to use open body language. You need to be aware of the types of faces that you're making, you know, because they can be translated to a type of judgment. You want to ask open-ended questions. And also in this one, and this is a tough one for me, is accepting that silence isn't failure in communication. Sometimes youth need time to process what's going on. And, you know, and in that we give youth space to be who they are without judgment. You know, creating an atmosphere of non-judgment, you know, it's active listening, it's encouraging reflection, making sure that you are being inclusive of their pronouns, and also being gentle on yourself in the process, but being willing to adjust and adapt. You want to work on policies of intentional inclusion. You want to take interest in what the kids are interested in and what youth are interested in. I'll be completely honest with you, my whole initial movement into social media was completely because of my work with youth. They did not want emails, and I've been doing this long enough that I used to use beepers. So they didn't want any of that. They wanted to be contacted on Facebook or Instagram. And so that's how I ended up moving into those spaces, because that's where the young adults are. And so it's really important to be aware of what youth are into. I wanted to just take a second to talk about shame again. It really is a big part, and our society historically has used shame to change behaviors. You know, there was, as an example, there was an issue with getting people to cross in crosswalks. And so what national newspapers did was launch this whole thing about calling people stupid and dumb for not crossing in the crosswalks because it was causing all of these accidents and things like that. And I use that as an example because we do this in micro and macro ways all the time in conversations with youth. You know, you don't want to be calling people dumb, silly, stupid. These are all ways of inducing shame, and it's really counterintuitive to trying to do the work. And all of this stuff is really serious, and I can't emphasize enough that sometimes we really have to intentionally focus on joy. It is really, really important for young people to know that it's okay to laugh. You know, the world is imploding right now, but quite honestly, even without a worldwide pandemic, things are sketchy, especially for our youth. So it's okay to be silly, it's okay to laugh and joke, and you know, it's okay to just have space to do that. The biggest thing, you know, two more things. Believe in youth when they tell you who they are. Let them lead the conversation. These policies have been really helpful through my time doing this work. I have not always understood what was going on directly when it was being talked to me or said to me, but I knew enough to shut my mouth and listen. And to then take all the time I needed and talk to all the people around me to figure out and to gain more understanding so that I could be more empathetic. And also, humility is really, really important. I think that people sometimes get caught up in leadership and advocacy and what that means and how that translates. And if you really want to serve, then you have to be humble. And you have to be willing to acknowledge that you don't know everything. You have to be willing to be gentle with yourself and forgive when you make a mistake, not only yourself, but others, and keep trying and keep your head up.
Any other panelists, Sarah?
So I think if we split this up between behavioral considerations and changes and policy changes. So if we think about behavioral changes, I think Lyndsey spoke to so many of those things, and just remembering that, like, we need to create space for youth to socially affirm their gender. We need to allow space for queer and trans youth to be able to be exactly who they are and show up and support them and love them exactly who they are, right? Yeah. And so that's all the behavioral stuff we can do. When it comes to policies, it starts to spiral a little bit out of control because there's so many different systems that impact youth. And so we have to remember that we live in a state that doesn't have non-discrimination protections. And so some of our youth can experience discrimination in service and not have standing. So we need to move to a space where we have non-discrimination, and also that we encourage agencies to implement best practices. There are best practices that exist for serving youth. The Department of Human Services has implemented those practices. I'm going to shout out Shauna again with Shauna, right? Like, so there are standards out there that can be implemented. So we need to remember those things. We need to remember that there is no homeless shelter system for youth in Pennsylvania. It's the child welfare system and how harmful that can be to queer and trans youth especially, and the overrepresentation of not only just trans and queer youth, but queer and trans youth of color, right? And the intersectionality of that and the importance of that. And so we need to make sure that those particular policies at the state level that regulate those agencies are shifted to assure that youth can get placed based on identity and not sex assigned at birth, right? We need to make sure that we are working in mental health systems and providing access to affirming care and not gatekeeping those services and not delaying care or telling youth that they have to show up in a particular way. And so when we think about policy, there's probably 100 different small things that we can chip away at, and we just need to start making those moves and pushing for those things to be implemented, because without standing, there's not a lot of space for what can come next to assure that youth are getting the support that they need.
Yeah. Tracy, were you gonna add something?
Yeah, no, I'm excited. Thank you, Sarah, for the policy discussion. I think it's really critical. It's a really important piece of this. I know twice in my career, I have worked with someone that I saw as an extraordinary person, queer person, youth, smart, but one of the things they needed from me, people come when they need things from you, was to be released to go back to their own schoolwork. And I do think it's important for us as supportive professionals in this really stressful space in the world to also encourage our youth who are passionate and care the most that it's okay for them to study physics for a whole year and not do anything political, even if trans lives are at stake, or to achieve excellence in other ways. That some people need to be free to do child things or youth things in this really, really stressful time, and to be assured that, you know, as adults, we can hold space for that work and do some of that work, and they can come back to that work. And like, that's what's been asked of me a couple of times that doesn't always come up in the conversation.
Yeah. And then lastly, Darren, did you have anything that you wanted to add on to this? Okay. Then our last question comes from an attendee, and it has to do with resources. They say that they're creating an infographic series about supportive mental health services in the Pittsburgh area. Do we know of any that specialize in working with queer youth? Does anyone have a resources that they wanted to specifically mention?
Where at again?
They say in the Pittsburgh area, so it sounds like greater Pittsburgh, Allegheny County.
I would just go with, you know, one of the places that I know of is Central Outreach. So they have just the walk-in clinic, and then upstairs they have the mental health services for LGBT.
I mean, what's a little shameless promotion? So at the Healing Wellness Foundation, we have launched Affirm, which is a CBT-based group that was created by and for LGBTQ youth, right? So instead of tweaking an intervention to fit queer and trans youth, this is one that was built for them. And so we will be having a couple of cohorts coming up this fall. The first one's in September. The second one is in October, which will be led by facilitators of color for youth of color. And so I think that those are important resources that are happening in our community. I think that there's a long list of mental health providers that are affirming, from private practitioners like Tracy to organizations and historical organizations. And so, you know, it's not a one size fits all approach. There are numbers of folks out there doing it. The Kaya Clinic as part of Children's Hospital is another resource that has historically worked with LGBTQ youth. So, you know, if you really want an exhaustive list, I'm happy to walk through that with you and share that, but know that that exists out there in a variety of places.
Yeah.
Oh, and I also have to say that, wow, I just lost my train of thought. It'll come back to me, sorry.
Anyone else with a specific resource they wanted to call out?
For trans men who, you know, want to have a baby, I have been going to it's Allegheny Reproductive Health Center, I think that's what it's called. I'll get you the right info. And that's here in East Liberty. It's like 9 minutes away from my house. And they are so affirming. It is crazy. Like, I've never been to, well, first of all, I've never been to a gynecologist in years. Mm-hmm. And second of all, the first time I like just walking through the door, you had posters, sayings, quotes everywhere, just affirming people not only for their color, their gender, their size, everything. Like, that place is a good place to go for trans men who want to, first of all, check out if everything's okay, and to if they want to have a baby.
Yeah, healthcare, reproductive health care for trans people is really hard to find, so that's really important. Lyndsey, were you going to add something?
Yeah, sure. You know, we have the Pittsburgh Youth Haven here over at Proud Haven in the north side. We're here 4 days a week specifically for youth, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 1 to 8 p.m., and Friday, 5 to 9. These are social support groups for youth, and we do everything from arts, crafts, talking about coping skills and dealing with stress, snacks and drinks, and we're a very welcoming and affirming space, and it's free.
Awesome. Any other resources that anyone wanted to call out? If not, I'm going to thank our panel so much for coming. Tracy, would you want to add something?
I'm guessing somebody said PFLAG.
Not yet. We haven't said PFLAG.
PFLAG is the organization supportive for parents and allies. And for people who are listening, who really have more questions or are looking for community to have conversations in, for some that has been really helpful and supportive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to add post-pandemic times, pre-pandemic times, they had PFLAG has a monthly dinner for parents and kids, which I watched grow from like 4 to 5 families meeting together to like 60 people in a room, which is really awesome. Right now, they're doing things virtually. They're actually doing a virtual potluck. I believe that's coming up soon.